Imagine stepping back in time to the United States in the year 1860. On the surface, it's a young, vibrant nation, full of promise and brimming with the spirit of manifest destiny. But just beneath this veneer of progress, a deep and dangerous rift is tearing the country apart. This isn't a story of a distant, foreign land. It's the story of America, on the brink of its most profound and devastating conflict, the Civil War. The air in 1860 was thick with tension, a palpable feeling of a storm about to break. For decades, the issue of slavery had been a festering wound, a moral and economic poison seeping into the very foundations of the Republic. In the North, a powerful abolitionist movement was gaining momentum. Voices like Frederick Douglass, a man who had escaped the bonds of slavery to become a brilliant orator, and writer, and William Lloyd Garrison, a fiery newspaper editor, were demanding an immediate end to what they called America's peculiar institution. Their words, printed in papers like The Liberator, spread across the northern states, galvanizing public opinion and painting slavery as a national sin that had to be purged. They argued from pulpits, in town halls, and on street corners that a nation conceived in liberty could not endure half slave and half free. This wasn't just a political debate for them. It was a moral crusade for the soul of America. Meanwhile, in the South, life moved to a different rhythm, one dictated by the vast plantations of cotton, tobacco, and sugar cane. The entire Southern economy, its social structure, and its way of life were inextricably linked to the institution of slavery. To Southern leaders and plantation owners, slavery wasn't just an economic necessity. It was a right, a tradition, and, in their view, a divinely ordained social order. They saw the abolitionist movement not as a call for justice, but as a direct attack on their property, their culture, and their very existence. Figures like John C. Calhoun of South Carolina had long championed the idea of states' rights, arguing that the federal government had no authority to interfere with a state's internal affairs, especially an institution as fundamental as slavery. This belief was deeply ingrained in the Southern psyche, creating an us versus them mentality that grew more defensive and more aggressive with each passing year. As the nation expanded westward, every new territory became a battleground. The question was simple but explosive. Would these new lands be free soil or slave soil? The Missouri Compromise of 1820 had tried to keep a fragile balance, but it was like putting a small bandage on a gaping wound. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 ripped that bandage right off. It introduced the idea of popular sovereignty, letting the settlers of these territories decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. The result was chaos. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded into Kansas, each side determined to win the territory for their cause. What followed was a brutal, small-scale civil war known as Bleeding Kansas. Men were tarred and feathered, towns were burned, and neighbors turned on neighbors in a terrifying preview of the national conflict to come. Then came the Dred Scott decision in 1857. The Supreme Court delivered a bombshell ruling that sent shockwaves across the nation. Dred Scott, an enslaved man who had lived in free territories, sued for his freedom. The court, led by Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, ruled against him. But it went much further. The decision declared that African Americans, whether enslaved or free, were not and could never be citizens of the United States. It also stated that the federal government had no power to prohibit slavery in the territories, effectively making the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional. For the North, this was an outrage, a blatant perversion of justice that seemed to open the entire country to slavery. For the South, it was a monumental victory, a legal confirmation of their deepest-held beliefs. The chasm between the two sides widened into a seemingly unbridgeable gulf. In 1859, a radical abolitionist named John Brown decided to take matters into his own hands. Convinced that only bloodshed could end slavery, he led a small band of followers in a raid on the federal armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. His plan was to seize weapons and incite a massive slave rebellion that would sweep across the South. The raid was a spectacular failure. Brown was quickly captured, tried for treason, and hanged. But his actions had a profound impact. In the North, many hailed him as a martyr, a hero who had died for the cause of liberty. In the South, he was seen as a terrorist, the embodiment of their worst fears, a violent abolitionist determined to destroy their way of life. The raid on Harper's Ferry electrified the nation, pushing both sides further toward the brink and making compromise seem all but impossible. The final straw was the presidential election of 1860. The Democratic Party, once a powerful national force, fractured over the issue of slavery, splitting into northern and southern factions. This division paved the way for the young Republican Party, a strictly northern party founded on the principle of preventing the expansion of slavery into the western territories. Their candidate was a lanky, eloquent lawyer from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln's name didn't even appear on the ballot in 10 southern states, but he won the election by carrying the populous North. For the South, Lincoln's victory was the ultimate catastrophe. They saw him as a radical abolitionist, a black Republican who was determined to destroy their way of life. Even though Lincoln had repeatedly stated he had no intention of interfering with slavery where it already existed, his opposition to its expansion was enough. The election of a president who did not represent their interests, and whom they believed was hostile to their very foundations, was the final signal that their place in the Union was no longer tenable. Before Lincoln could even take the oath of office, the dominoes began to fall. In December of 1860, South Carolina, the heartland of secessionist sentiment, officially voted to leave the Union. The declaration was clear. The federal Union had failed to protect their rights and was now in the hands of a hostile government. Over the next few months, 6 more states from the deep South Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed suit. They formed a new nation, the Confederate States of America, and prepared to defend their newfound independence. And so, as the winter of 1861 turned to spring, the United States of America was no longer united. It was a nation divided, a house broken in two. The arguments had ended. The debates were over. Decades of rising tensions, moral crusades, economic anxieties, and political failures had brought the country to this point. The stage was set for a conflict that would test the very meaning of America, a war that would pit brother against brother and ultimately decide whether a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal could long endure. The cannons were about to roar, and the bloodiest chapter in American history was about to begin. Thanks for watching this chapter of our series. If you want to understand what happened next, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on so you don't miss the next episode. We'll see you then. Welcome back to our series on the life of Abraham Lincoln. Today, we are rediving into one of the most tumultuous periods in American history, Lincoln's early presidency. Imagine this. You've just been elected president, but before you even take the oath of office, the country you're supposed to lead is literally falling apart. That was the reality for Abraham Lincoln in the winter of 1860. His election on November 6th was the final straw for the southern states. They saw his victory, without a single Southern electoral vote, as a clear sign that their way of life, built on the institution of slavery, was under direct threat. The reaction was swift. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina held a convention and voted unanimously to secede from the Union. They declared the Union, now subsisting between South Carolina and other states, under the name of the United States of America, is hereby dissolved. It was a political earthquake, and the aftershocks were just beginning. Over the next few weeks, the dominoes fell. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas all followed South Carolina's lead. In early February 1861, delegates from these states met in Montgomery, Alabama, to form a new nation, the Confederate States of America. They drafted their own constitution, one that explicitly protected slavery, and they elected their own president, a former U.S. Senator from Mississippi named Jefferson Davis. All of this happened during the lame duck period, while President James Buchanan was still in office, seemingly paralyzed and unable to stop the nation's disintegration. So, when Abraham Lincoln finally arrived in Washington, D.C. for his inauguration on March 4th, 1861, he wasn't just taking over a country. He was inheriting a full-blown crisis. The capital itself was tense, filled with rumors of assassination plots. In fact, Lincoln's journey to Washington had been secretive and fraught with danger. He had to be snuck into the city under the cover of darkness to avoid potential threats. On Inauguration Day, the mood was somber. Sharpshooters were positioned on rooftops, and cavalry patrolled the streets. Lincoln stood on the east portico of the Capitol, a building whose dome was still under construction, a powerful, if unintentional, symbol of the unfinished and fractured nation. It was here that he delivered his first inaugural address, one of the most important speeches in American history. He wasn't aggressive or confrontational. Instead, his tone was one of firm, yet sorrowful, reconciliation. He started by reassuring the South that he had no intention of interfering with slavery where it already existed. He said, "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so." He was trying to extend an olive branch to calm the fears that had driven them to secession, but he also made it unequivocally clear that secession was illegal and that the Union was perpetual. He argued that no state, on its own whim, could lawfully leave the Union. He declared that he would uphold his constitutional oath to preserve, protect, and defend the government, which included holding on to federal property in the seceded states. He was drawing a line in the sand, but he was doing it with a plea for peace. The most famous and moving part of his speech came at the very end. He appealed not to legal arguments or political theory, but to the shared history and emotional bonds of the American people. He said, "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union, when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature." It was a beautiful and powerful appeal, but it fell on deaf ears in the South. The Confederacy had already been formed. The lines had been drawn. The question was no longer if there would be a conflict, but where and when it would start. And the answer came just over a month later, at a small federal fort in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. The name of that fort was Fort Sumter. It was one of the few remaining federal outposts in the seceded states, and its garrison was running desperately low on supplies. Lincoln was faced with an impossible choice. If he sent supplies, the Confederacy would almost certainly see it as an act of aggression and attack the fort. If he abandoned the fort, it would be seen as a de facto recognition of the Confederacy's legitimacy, a sign of weakness that could shatter what was left of federal authority. Lincoln, in a masterful political move, decided to thread the needle. He notified the governor of South Carolina that he was sending a ship with only food and provisions, no troops, no weapons. The move cleverly shifted the burden of starting a war onto the Confederates. Now, if they fired on an unarmed supply ship, they would be the clear aggressors. Jefferson Davis and his cabinet in Montgomery took the bait. They couldn't allow a symbol of U.S. authority to remain in one of their most important harbors. They demanded the fort's surrender. Major Robert Anderson, the Union commander, refused. So, at 4:30 in the morning on April 12, 1861, Confederate batteries opened fire on Fort Sumter. The bombardment lasted for 34 hours. Miraculously, no one was killed in the actual fighting. On April 14th, Major Anderson surrendered the fort. The attack on Fort Sumter electrified the North. The time for debate and compromise was over. Lincoln's call for the better angels of our nature had been answered with cannon fire. The abstract concept of union was now something to be defended with blood. On April 15th, the day after Fort Sumter fell, Lincoln issued a proclamation calling for 75,000 volunteer soldiers from the states to serve for 90 days to put down the rebellion. He believed, as did many in the North, that this would be a short, decisive conflict. They were tragically mistaken. Lincoln's call for troops had an immediate and dramatic effect. It forced the remaining slave states in the Upper South to choose a side. Virginia, a state with deep historical ties to the founding of the nation, seceded, followed by Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina. The Confederacy had nearly doubled in size, and its new capital was moved to Richmond, Virginia. Just 100 miles from Washington, D.C., the battle lines were now clearly drawn. The nation was officially at war with itself. In those first chaotic months, Lincoln had to be more than just a president. He had to be a commander-in-chief, a diplomat, and a political strategist all at once. He worked tirelessly, often sleeping just a few hours a night at the White House. He had to assemble a cabinet, which he famously filled with his political rivals, a Team of rivals, as historian Doris Kearns Goodwin called it. Men like William Seward, Salmon Passio-Chassé, and Edward Bates had all competed with him for the presidency. Lincoln believed he needed the strongest and most capable minds to help him save the Union, even if they didn't always agree with him. He also faced immense pressure from the public and the press. Cries of "On to Richmond" echoed throughout the North. Everyone wanted a quick and glorious victory. Bowing to this pressure, Lincoln ordered the newly formed Union Army under the command of General Irvin McDowell to march south and confront the Confederate forces gathered near a small creek called Bull Run near the town of Manassas, Virginia. On July 21, 1861, the first Battle of Bull Run was fought. At first, it seemed like a Union victory was at hand. The Federal troops pushed the Confederates back, but the arrival of Confederate reinforcements and the steadfast stand of a Virginia brigade under General Thomas Jackson, who earned his famous nickname, Stonewall. They turned the tide. The Union advance stalled, then faltered, and then turned into a full-blown, panicked retreat. The soldiers, many of whom were civilians just weeks earlier, threw down their weapons and fled back to Washington, D.C. The defeated Bull Run was a profound shock to the North and to Lincoln. It shattered the illusion of a short, 90-day war. The retreat was humiliating, and it laid bare the reality that this would be a long, bloody, and difficult struggle. For Lincoln, it was a harsh lesson in the realities of war and leadership. It showed him that victory would not come easily, and that he needed to prepare the nation for a much greater sacrifice than anyone had imagined. In the wake of Bull Run, Lincoln took decisive action. He called for a massive mobilization of 500,000 more volunteers, this time to serve for 3 years. He replaced McDowell with a charismatic young general named George B. McClellan, who was renowned for his organizational skills. McClellan would spend the next several months building and training the Union's main fighting force, the Army of the Potomac, into a formidable military machine. These first few months of Lincoln's presidency were a true trial by fire. He had navigated the secession crisis, made the fateful decision at Fort Sumter, rallied the North after the attack, and endured the humbling defeat at Bull Run. He had made difficult, sometimes controversial decisions, including suspending the writ of habeas corpus to deal with dissenters in the border states. Through it all, he was learning on the job, growing into the role of a wartime president, and laying the groundwork for the immense struggle that lay ahead. The path was dark and uncertain, but Abraham Lincoln's resolve to preserve the Union, forged in these early days, would never waver. Thanks for watching. Join us next time as we explore the unfolding of the Civil War and Lincoln's struggle to find a general who could win it. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next chapter. See you then. Hey everyone, welcome back to our deep dive into the American Civil War. In our last chapter, we saw the nation teetering on the brink. 7 states had already seceded, forming the Confederacy. But the question on everyone's mind was, would it come to war? Today, in Chapter 3, we witness the spark that ignited the flame. The Civil War erupts. The date is April 12, 1861. The place, a man-made island in the middle of Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. On this island stands Fort Sumter, a federal military installation. For the newly formed Confederacy, this fort was a symbol of northern intrusion right in their busiest port. For the Union, under the newly inaugurated President Abraham Lincoln, it was a symbol of federal authority. Giving it up would be a sign of weakness, an admission that secession was legitimate. Major Robert Anderson, the Union commander at the fort, was in a tough spot. His supplies were dwindling. His garrison of about 85 men was surrounded by hostile Confederate forces under the command of General P.G.T. Beauregard. Ironically, Anderson had been Beauregard's artillery instructor at West Point. Now, student and teacher were on opposite sides of a looming conflict. Lincoln faced a monumental decision. Sending a heavily armed naval fleet to reinforce the fort could be seen as an act of aggression, potentially pushing the wavering border states like Virginia and Maryland to secede. Doing nothing would mean abandoning federal property and legitimizing the Confederacy. So, he chose a middle path. He announced he would be sending a ship with only food and supplies, no troops or ammunition. He was essentially forcing the Confederacy's hand. Would they allow the resupply, or would they fire the first shot? The Confederate government in Montgomery, Alabama, saw this as a challenge they couldn't ignore. They ordered General Beauregard to demand the fort's immediate surrender. Major Anderson refused. At 4:30 in the morning on April 12th, the first Confederate cannon fired on Fort Sumter. The bombardment lasted for 34 straight hours. From the rooftops and shores of Charleston, civilians gathered to watch the spectacle, almost like it was a fireworks display, not realizing it was the start of the deadliest war in American history. Inside the fort, Anderson and his men were outgunned and overwhelmed. They returned fire, but their efforts were largely ineffective against the shore batteries. Miraculously, after Mortan, 3,000 shells were fired at the fort. Not a single Union soldier was killed by the Confederate bombardment. The only casualties occurred after the surrender, during a 100-gun salute to the American flag, when a cannon misfired, killing 2 Union soldiers. On April 14th, Major Anderson surrendered Fort Sumter. The Confederate flag was raised over the fort, and the Civil War had begun. The news of Fort Sumter electrified both the North and the South. Any hope for a peaceful resolution was shattered. Lincoln immediately issued a call for 75,000 volunteers to serve for 90 days to put down the rebellion. He believed, as did many in the North, that this would be a short, decisive conflict. The response was overwhelming. Across the North, men rushed to enlist, eager to defend the Union. Public opinion, which had been divided, now solidified. Patriotism surged. The cry was "Save the Union." The South saw Lincoln's call to arms as a declaration of war. They viewed it as an act of invasion against their sovereignty. In response, 4 more states of Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee sided and joined the Confederacy, bringing the total to 11. The Confederate capital was moved from Montgomery to Richmond, Virginia, just 100 miles from the Union capital in Washington, D.C. The stage was now set for a massive conflict between 2 determined opponents. So, how did these 2 sides stack up against each other as they prepared for war? Let's look at the advantages and disadvantages. The Union, or the North, had some significant advantages. It had a much larger population, about 22 million people compared to the Confederacy's 9 million, and of 9 million. Nearly 4 million were enslaved people who were not going to be fighting for the Confederacy. This population advantage meant a larger pool of manpower for the army and for the workforce. The North was also an industrial powerhouse. It had over 90% of the nation's factories. This meant it could produce its own weapons, ammunition, uniforms, and other essential war materials. The Union also had a vast and efficient railway network, which was crucial for moving troops and supplies quickly over long distances. They controlled the Navy, allowing them to blockade southern ports, and had an established government and a stable financial system. But the North had its disadvantages too. To win the war, they had to invade, conquer, and occupy the vast territory of the South. This was a massive undertaking. They were fighting an offensive war on unfamiliar ground. Public opinion, while initially strong, could waver if the war dragged on and casualties mounted, and initially, their military leadership was less experienced than the South's. Now let's look at the Confederacy. The South. Their greatest advantage was arguably their military leadership. Many of the most experienced and respected officers in the U.S. Army, like Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and James Longstreet, were from the South. They resigned their commissions and chose to fight for their home states. The South also had the advantage of fighting a defensive war. They didn't need to conquer the North. They just needed to defend their own territory and outlast the Union's will to fight. Their soldiers were often more accustomed to outdoor life, riding horses and using firearms. They were fighting to defend their homes, their land, and what they called their way of life, which gave them a powerful, motivating cause, at least in their own eyes. However, the Confederacy faced enormous disadvantages. Their economy was overwhelmingly agricultural, based on cash crops like cotton and tobacco, which they couldn't eat. They had very few factories to produce weapons and supplies, forcing them to rely on imports from Europe. But the Union naval blockade, known as the Anaconda Plan, aimed to squeeze the life out of the Southern economy by cutting off this trade. Their lack of railroads made it difficult to transport men and materials. Their new government was weak and struggled to raise money and exert authority over the fiercely independent states, and their reliance on slavery was a major moral and strategic weakness. It prevented them from gaining full diplomatic recognition or support from anti-slavery's European powers like Great Britain and France. As both sides mobilized, there was a widespread belief that the war would be over in a matter of months. Young men in both the North and South enlisted with a sense of excitement and romanticism, fearing the war would be over before they got a chance to see any action and prove their manhood. They had no idea of the horrors that awaited them. They drilled in freshly sewn uniforms, paraded through cheering crowds, and confidently predicted a swift victory. In the summer of 1861, this confidence would be put to the test. The Union Army, full of those 90-day volunteers, marched south from Washington towards Richmond, hoping to capture the Confederate capital and end the war in one fell swoop. The Confederates gathered an army to meet them. The two forces would clash near a small stream in Virginia called Bull Run. This first major battle would shatter the illusion of a short, glorious war, and give both sides a brutal taste of the long, bloody struggle that lay ahead. The eruption of war at Fort Sumter set the nation on a path of unimaginable conflict. Both the Union and the Confederacy entered the war with distinct advantages and crippling weaknesses, and a shared, naive belief in a quick victory. In our next chapter, we'll dive into the First Battle of Bull Run and see how the realities of industrial warfare began to dawn on a nation that was tearing itself apart. Thanks so much for watching. If you're finding this series helpful, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter. See you next time. Hey everyone, and welcome back to our deep dive into the American Civil War. Today, we're tackling Chapter 4, and it's a big one. Slavery at the heart of the conflict. Now, you've probably heard people say the Civil War was about states' rights, or tariffs, or different ways of life. And while those things were part of the conversation, they all orbited around one central, undeniable issue: the institution of human slavery. To truly understand the war, we have to understand why slavery was so deeply embedded in the American fabric, particularly in the South, that its preservation was deemed worth fighting and dying for. Let's start with the economics. By 1860, the South was not just a society with slaves. It was a slave society. Its entire economic engine was built on the backs of enslaved people. The phrase King Cotton wasn't just a catchy slogan. It was a reality. The cotton produced by enslaved labor was the single most valuable export of the United States. It fueled the textile mills of the North and of Great Britain, making it a cornerstone of the global economy. The wealth tied up in enslaved people was staggering. In fact, the market value of the 4 million enslaved individuals was greater than the value of all the factories, railroads, and banks in the entire country combined. So, when we talk about the Southern economy, we're talking about an economy where the primary form of capital wasn't land or machinery, but human beings. This created a powerful and deeply entrenched plantered class, a wealthy elite whose social status, political power, and immense fortunes were directly tied to owning other people. For them, any threat to slavery wasn't just a moral or a political debate. It was an existential threat to their entire way of life and their economic existence. This economic dependency meant that the South's leaders would go to extreme lengths to protect the institution. But it wasn't just about the money for the wealthy elite. Slavery warped the entire social structure of the South. For the vast majority of white Southerners who did not own slaves, the system still offered a perceived benefit. It created a rigid racial hierarchy that placed all white people, no matter how poor, in a position of superiority over all black people. This concept of white supremacy was a powerful social glue. It gave poor white farmers a sense of status and identity, and it unified them politically with the wealthy planters. They might not have owned slaves themselves, but they fought to protect a system that guaranteed their elevated social standing. The fear of what would happen if 4 million enslaved people were freed socially, politically, and economically was a potent motivator that drove many to support secession and the Confederacy. Politically, the conflict over slavery had been simmering for decades. Every time the United States expanded westward, the question of whether new territories would be free or slave became a flashpoint. Events like the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act were all desperate attempts to balance the power between free and slave states in Congress. The South saw the growing population and industrial power of the North as a direct threat. They feared they would eventually lose their political influence to block anti-slavery legislation. They demanded federal protection for slavery, including the infamous Fugitive Slave Act, which forced Northerners to participate in the capture and return of escaped slaves. This leads us to the core ideological clash. The North, while far from a racial paradise, was increasingly developing a free labor ideology. This idea held that society should be based on the value of individual labor and the ability for people to improve their station in life. Slavery was the direct opposite of this vision. It was seen as anti-democratic, economically backward, and morally corrupt. Abolitionists, though initially a radical minority, grew in influence, powerfully arguing that slavery was a national sin that violated both Christian morality and the nation as founding principles of liberty and equality. Conversely, the South developed a robust pro-slavery ideology to defend itself. Leaders like John C. Calhoun and later Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens stopped calling slavery a necessary evil and began championing it as a positive good. They argued that slavery was a benign, paternalistic system that civilized African people, was sanctioned by the Bible, and was the foundation for a stable, orderly society. Alexander Stephens, in his famous Cornerstone speech of 1861, stated plainly that the new Confederate government was founded on the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery's subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. There it is, in their own words. When Southern states began to secede from the Union following Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860, their declarations of secession were explicit. They didn't hide their motives. Mississippi's declaration stated, "Opposition is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world." Texas was equally clear, citing the North's hostility to the beneficent and patriarchal system of African slavery. The argument for states' rights was almost always invoked for a specific purpose: the right of a state to perpetuate and expand the institution of slavery without federal interference. So, when the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter, it was the culmination of this long, bitter struggle. It wasn't about tariffs. It wasn't about an abstract principle of governance. It was about two fundamentally opposed visions for the future of America. And at the heart of that opposition was the question of whether the nation would continue to be one where millions of people were held in bondage. The war was fought to resolve this question. The immense bloodshed and sacrifice were ultimately the price paid to finally confront the nation's original sin and, as Lincoln would later say, to give the nation a new birth of freedom. Understanding this is not about assigning blame. It's about acknowledging the historical truth at the very center of this defining chapter in American history. Thanks so much for watching. This is a heavy but crucial topic, and I appreciate you joining me to explore it. If you found this helpful, please give it a like, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter in our series. See you next time. Have you ever wondered how Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator, wasn't always so set on freeing the slaves? It's one of history's most fascinating transformations. Let's dive into the complex journey of a president wrestling with a nation torn apart. When the first shots of the Civil War were fired, Lincoln's primary, crystal clear goal was one thing and one thing only: to preserve the Union. He famously wrote to Horace Greeley, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery." This wasn't because he was far from Italiano. He personally found the institution morally repulsive. But he was a pragmatist, a lawyer, a politician. He knew that the border state slave states that remained in the Union, like Kentucky, Missouri, and Maryland, were hanging on by a thread. Any sudden move towards abolition could push them into the arms of the Confederacy, a loss the Union simply couldn't afford. So, in the early days of the war, Lincoln's policy was one of careful containment. He even supported the initial Fugitive Slave Act, which required Union soldiers to return escaped slaves to their owners. Imagine the moral conflict there. You're fighting a war against a rebellion built on slavery, yet your own laws forced you to send people back into bondage. This created immense tension. Abolitionists, like Frederick Douglass, were hammering Lincoln, calling him out for his hesitation. They argued, rightfully so, that the war was fundamentally about slavery, and to ignore that was to fight with one hand tied behind your back. But the battlefield has a way of changing things. As the war dragged on, the casualty lists grew longer and longer. The initial belief that this would be a quick, decisive conflict evaporated in the smoke of battles like Bull Run and Shiloh. Lincoln started to see things differently. This wasn't just a political squabble anymore. It was a brutal, existential struggle for the nation's soul. And then, a new argument began to take hold. One that perfectly blended military strategy with moral imperative. The Confederacy was using enslaved labor to build fortifications, transport supplies, and grow food, freeing up more white men to fight. Every person toiling on a Southern plantation was directly contributing to the Confederate war machine. From a purely strategic standpoint, freeing these people wasn't just a moral act. It was a military necessity. It would cripple the South's ability to wage war. This is where we see Lincoln the master strategist emerge. He began testing the waters. In 1862, he approved the Confiscation Acts, which allowed the Union Army to seize Confederate property, including enslaved people. This was a clever legal maneuver. They weren't freed, but confiscated as contraband of war. This gave Union generals on the ground, like Benjamin Butler, the legal cover to shelter and protect those who escaped to Union lines. Thousands flocked to these contraband camps, a testament to their burning desire for freedom. Lincoln was walking a tightrope. He still feared the political fallout in the border states. He even proposed a plan for gradual, compensated emancipation, where the federal government would pay slave owners to free their slaves over time. He pleaded with the border states to accept this compromise, seeing it as a way to shorten the war and peacefully end slavery. But they rejected it. They clung to the institution, unable to see the writing on the wall. Their refusal, in a way, freed Lincoln's hand. He had offered a moderate path, and it was refused. The turning point came in the summer of 1862. The Union was not winning. General McClellan's Grand Peninsula campaign had failed. Morale was low. Lincoln knew a drastic change was needed. He confided in his cabinet that he had made a promise to himself and to his God that if the Union Army could achieve a significant victory, he would issue a proclamation of emancipation. It was a deeply personal, almost spiritual decision. He saw it as the only way to re-energize the Union cause and give the war a higher moral purpose. That victory came on September 17, 1862, at the Battle of Antietam. It was the single bloodiest day in American history, a horrific, brutal clash. But technically, it was a Union victory because Robert E. Lee's invasion of the North had been turned back. That was all Lincoln needed. 5 days later, he issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. This document was a masterpiece of political calculation. It declared that as of January 1st, 1863, all enslaved people in territories currently in rebellion against the United States shall be thenceforward, and forever free. Notice the wording. It didn't apply to the border states or to parts of the South already under Union control. Why? Because Lincoln was still operating within the bounds of his constitutional authority as Commander-in-Chief. His justification was that this was a war measure designed to weaken the enemy. He couldn't legally free slaves in loyal territories. The reaction was explosive. Abolitionists were thrilled, though some wished it had gone further. The border states were nervous but didn't secede. And in Europe, where countries like Britain and France had been considering recognizing the Confederacy, the proclamation changed the entire dynamic. It transformed the American Civil War from a mere political dispute into an explicit crusade against slavery. No European power, having already abolished slavery themselves, could now morally justify siding with the Confederacy. It was a diplomatic masterstroke. On January 1st, 1863, Lincoln signed the final Emancipation Proclamation. From that day forward, the war had a new meaning. The Union Army wasn't just fighting for reunification, it was an army of liberation. The proclamation also authorized the enlistment of black soldiers into the Union Army. This was another game. Over the next 2 years, nearly 200,000 black men, many of them formerly enslaved, would take up arms to fight for their own freedom and the preservation of the Union. Their courage and sacrifice on battlefields like Fort Wagner and the Crater proved their commitment and shattered racist stereotypes. Lincoln's own words show how profoundly his thinking had evolved. In 1861, he was focused solely on the Union. By his Gettysburg Address in November 1863, he was speaking of a new birth of freedom. And by his second inaugural address in 1865, his language was that of a prophet. He spoke of the war as divine punishment for the sin of slavery, suggesting that the bloodshed might be the price America had to pay for 250 years of unrequited toil. It's a mistake to see Lincoln's journey as a simple flip-flop. It was a gradual, painful, and deeply thoughtful evolution. He was pushed by the realities of war, pulled by the moral arguments of abolitionists, and guided by his own conscience. He began the war as a politician, trying to save a country, and ended it as a statesman who redefined what that country stood for. His transformation from a unionist pragmatist to the great emancipator is not a story of indecision, but of growth under the immense pressure of history. It shows that even the greatest leaders don't always start with all the answers, but find them along the difficult path of duty. Thank you so much for watching. If you've found this journey through Lincoln's mind as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. See you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our series. Today, in Chapter 6, we're diving into the powerful and persistent voices that refuse to be silenced. The abolitionists. While politicians debated and compromised, these men and women were on the front lines, demanding immediate and uncompromising freedom for all enslaved people. Their pressure was a moral force that reshaped the national conversation and pushed the country closer to the brink of conflict, ultimately forcing the issue of emancipation. Let's start with William Lloyd Garrison, a name that for many became synonymous with radical abolitionism. In 1831, Garrison launched his newspaper, The Liberator, and its first issue set a tone of fiery, unyielding conviction. He famously wrote, "I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard." And he was heard. For over 3 decades, The Liberator was a beacon for the anti-slavery movement. Garrison didn't just argue against slavery. He condemned it as a moral sin and a stain on the nation's soul. He called the Constitution a covenant with death and an agreement with hell because of its protections for slavery. This was radical stuff. He advocated for immediatism, the immediate, uncompensated emancipation of all enslaved people. He didn't believe in gradual plans or colonization schemes. For him, the only just solution was freedom. Now, Garrison's approach was moral suasion. He believed that by exposing the true horrors and immorality of slavery, he could change the hearts and minds of white Americans. He helped found the American Anti-Slavery Society in 1833, which grew to have hundreds of thousands of members. Through speeches, petitions, and his powerful writing, Garrison relentlessly attacked the institution of slavery, making it impossible for the nation to ignore the moral crisis it faced. His radicalism alienated some, but it also inspired a generation of activists who were tired of compromise. Now, let's talk about a man who knew the brutality of slavery firsthand. Frederick Douglass. Born into bondage in Maryland, Douglass escaped to freedom in 1838 and became one of the most powerful orators and writers of the 19th century. His autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, was a bombshell. It was a first-hand account, written with stunning eloquence, that exposed the brutal reality of slavery in a way that abstract arguments never could. People couldn't dismiss it as propaganda. It was his life. Douglass's very existence as a brilliant, articulate, and fiercely intelligent man shattered the racist ideologies used to justify slavery. He was living proof that black people were in every way the equals of whites. Initially, Douglass was a follower of Garrison, believing in moral suasion. But over time, his views evolved. He began to believe that political action was necessary. He broke with Garrison and argued that the Constitution, despite its flaws, could be used as a weapon against slavery. He famously asked in his 1852 speech, "What to the slave is the 4th of July?" He highlighted the hypocrisy of a nation celebrating freedom while millions were in chains. Douglass's voice was one of both moral authority and political pragmatism. He used his newspaper, The North Star, to advocate for abolition and equal rights. He advised presidents, including Abraham Lincoln, constantly pushing for emancipation and the right of black men to fight for their own freedom. His journey from an enslaved person to a statesman is one of the most inspiring stories in American history, and his pressure was instrumental in shifting political tides. And then there was Harriet Tubman, often called Moses, by the people she led to freedom. Tubman wasn't a writer or a public speaker in the same way as Garrison or Douglass, but her actions spoke louder than any words. After escaping slavery herself, she risked her life again and again, returning to the South at least 13 times to guide more than 70 enslaved people to freedom through the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad wasn't a real railroad, of course, but a secret network of safe houses, routes, and brave individuals who helped fugitives escape to the North or to Canada. Tubman was its most famous conductor. The journeys were incredibly dangerous. They traveled by night, hiding in swamps and forests, always on the lookout for slave catchers who were hunting them with dogs. Tubman was a master of disguise and strategy. She carried a pistol not only for protection but also to threaten any frightened escapee who considered turning back, knowing that a single person's capture could compromise the entire network. Her motto was, "I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger." Her bravery was legendary. Beyond the Underground Railroad, during the Civil War, she served as a scout, spy, and nurse for the Union Army. She even led an armed raid along the Combahee River in South Carolina, liberating more than 750 enslaved people. Harriet Tubman's direct action was a form of pressure that was physical and immediate. She didn't just talk about freedom, she delivered it. So, how did these three figures and the thousands of abolitionists they inspired actually exert pressure? First, they shaped public opinion. Through newspapers like The Liberator and the North Star, countless pamphlets and speaking tours, they kept the issue of slavery in the public eye. They organized petition drives, flooding Congress with signatures demanding an end to slavery. This constant agitation made it impossible for slavery to be a settled issue. Second, they created a moral and political crisis. Garrison's radicalism forced even moderate anti-slavery advocates to take a stronger stance. Douglass's intellectual power and political savvy made him a key advisor, pushing leaders like Lincoln towards more decisive action. Tubman's direct defiance of the Fugitive Slave Act showed that the laws of the land were considered illegitimate by those fighting for justice. They made it clear that there was a higher moral law. Third, their actions provoked a fierce reaction in the South. Southern leaders saw abolitionists as dangerous fanatics, trying to incite slave rebellions and destroy their way of life. They cracked down on any anti-slavery dissent, burned abolitionist literature, and demanded that the federal government protect their property. This heightened sectional tensions and made compromise increasingly difficult. The abolitionists were, in many ways, the conscience of the nation. They were often unpopular, even in the North, where many feared that their agitation would lead to war. They were threatened, attacked, and sometimes even killed for their beliefs, but they refused to back down. They understood that there could be no true peace or justice in a nation that was half slave and half slave. The pressure they applied was relentless and multifaceted, was moral, political, and physical. It was the work of Garrison's pen, Douglass's voice, and Tubman's courage. They forced a conversation that many wanted to avoid, and in doing so, they set the stage for the conflict that would ultimately bring about the end of slavery. Their legacy reminds us that change often comes from those who are willing to speak uncomfortable truths and demand justice, no matter the cost. Thank you for joining me for this chapter. Their stories are a testament to the power of conviction and courage. Next time, we'll explore how these growing tensions finally erupted into open conflict. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss it. See you. 10. When the Civil War began, it wasn't officially about ending slavery. The North's primary goal was to preserve the Union. But thousands of enslaved people had a different idea. They saw the chaos of war not just as a conflict between states, but as their long-awaited chance for freedom. And they weren't going to wait for politicians to decide their fate. They took matters into their own hands. From the very first shots fired, a massive, unorganized, and powerful movement began. Enslaved men, women, and children started leaving plantations and farms, making their way towards the approaching Union armies. This wasn't a trickle, it was a flood. They risked everything brutal punishment, even death for a chance at liberty. Imagine the courage it took, leaving the only home you've ever known, with nothing but the clothes on your back, and walking for miles, sometimes for days, through hostile territory, all for a hope of freedom that wasn't even guaranteed. These freedom seekers arrived at Union camps, presenting a huge dilemma for the federal government and its commanders. The official policy at the start of the war was murky. Some Union generals, trying to appease slave-holding states that remained in the Union, actually returned escaped slaves to their enslavers. It was a shocking and contradictory policy. The Union was fighting the Confederacy, yet helping to uphold the very institution that fueled the Southern economy. But one General Benjamin Butler at Fort Monroe, in Virginia, made a groundbreaking decision in May 1861. When 3 enslaved men who'd been forced to build Confederate defenses escaped to his fort, their enslaver. A Confederate colonel demanded their return under the Fugitive Slave Act. Butler refused. He declared the men to be contraband of war. This term, contraband, was a stroke of genius. It was a legal argument that turned the Confederacy's own logic against it. If the Confederacy considered enslaved people to be property, and that property was being used to help the Confederate war effort, then the Union Army had the right to seize it. Just like they would seize enemy cannons or supplies. This wasn't about human rights yet, not officially. It was a military strategy. But the effect was revolutionary. The word spread like wildfire through the enslaved communities. Contraband. It was a word of hope. Fort Monroe became a beacon of freedom, known as Freedom's Fortress. The number of people escaping 2 Union lines exploded. Soon, contraband camps sprung up alongside Union Army encampments all across the South. These camps were often overcrowded and poorly supplied, with disease being a constant threat. Life was incredibly difficult. But for the people there, it was the first taste of freedom, and that was everything. The actions of these thousands of self-emancipating people forced the U.S. government's hand. They created a situation that Congress and President Lincoln could no longer ignore. They were no longer just property. They were a political force. They were demonstrating with their feet that the war and slavery were inseparable. Their presence in Union camps made it clear that to win the war, the Union had to deal with the issue of slavery. In 1861 and 1862, Congress began to pass laws that reflected this new reality. The first Confiscation Act of 1861 authorized the Union to seize any property, including enslaved people, being used to support the Confederate rebellion. This was basically codifying Butler's contraband policy into law. Then, the Second Confiscation Act, in July 1862, went even further. It declared that any enslaved person who escaped to Union lines, or who was in territory captured by the Union, would be forever free. This was a massive step. It wasn't full emancipation for everyone, but it was a declaration of freedom for hundreds of thousands. These acts were a direct result of the pressure created by the enslaved people themselves. They had successfully turned the Union Army into an army of liberation, whether it had intended to be or not. These contrabands didn't just wait for freedom to be handed to them. They actively contributed to the Union war effort. They worked as cooks, laundresses, blacksmiths, nurses, and laborers. They built fortifications and dug trenches. Their knowledge of the local terrain was invaluable to Union generals. They acted as scouts, guides, and spies, providing crucial intelligence about Confederate troop movements and plans. Their labor was essential. By taking their work away from the Confederacy, they weakened the Southern economy and its ability to wage war. And by providing their labor to the Union, they strengthened the Northern war machine. They were, in effect, fighting their own war for freedom from within the larger conflict. The stories from this period are incredible. Men like Robert Smalls, who was enslaved in Charleston, South Carolina, commandeered a Confederate transport ship. The CSS Planta sailed it past Confederate defenses with his family and other enslaved people on board, and delivered it to the Union Navy. His heroic act was a powerful symbol of the determination to be free. So, when we think about the end of slavery, it is crucial to remember that it was on something that was simply granted by Abraham Lincoln or the Union government. The Emancipation Proclamation was a pivotal moment. Absolutely. But the path to that proclamation was paved by the courageous actions of thousands upon thousands of enslaved people who seized their own freedom. They forced the issue onto the national stage and made emancipation an unavoidable war aim. They were the true agents of their own liberation. Their collective flight to freedom was one of the largest and most successful acts of civil disobedience in American history, and it fundamentally changed the course of the Civil War and the nation itself. Thanks for watching, and if you found this insightful, be sure to like and subscribe for more chapters in this story. Hello and welcome back to our series. Today, in Chapter 9, we're diving deep into the electrifying and chaotic aftermath of the Emancipation Proclamation. How did a single document send such powerful shockwaves across a divided nation? Let's find out. Imagine the scene in the North. For abolitionists, this was the moment they had prayed for, fought for, and dreamed of for decades. Picture Frederick Douglass, a man who had escaped the bonds of slavery to become its most eloquent opponent. Upon hearing the news, he described the moment as one of unbounded joy. In cities like Boston and Philadelphia, free black communities erupted in celebration. Church bells rang, people poured into the streets, and services of thanksgiving were held late into the night. It was more than a political victory. It was a moral and spiritual triumph. It felt like the dawn of a new era, a promise that the nation was finally turning toward justice. For these activists, the war now had a clear, righteous purpose, the total and complete abolition of slavery. But not everyone in the North was celebrating. Far from Italiano. In many working-class neighborhoods, especially among Irish and German immigrants, the proclamation was met with fear and resentment. These communities were already struggling, and they worried that newly freed black people would flood the labor market, driving down wages and taking their jobs. This economic anxiety was potent. The phrase, "a rich man's war and a poor man's fight," took on a new, bitter meaning. Some felt they were being forced to fight and die for a cause that didn't benefit them, or worse, that actively harmed their livelihoods. This sentiment would tragically boil over into violent events like the New York City draft riots, where racial and class tensions exploded in the streets. Now, let's turn our attention to the soldiers in the Union Army. Their reactions were just as complex and varied. For many, especially those from abolitionist strongholds in New England, the proclamation was a massive morale boost. It gave them a noble cause to rally behind. They weren't just fighting to preserve the Union anymore. They were fighting to end slavery, to liberate millions. Letters from these soldiers home are filled with a renewed sense of purpose. They saw themselves as crusaders in a battle for human freedom. One soldier from Massachusetts wrote that the proclamation was a righteous act and that he was now proud to serve in an army of liberation. However, for a significant number of other Union soldiers, particularly those from the border states like Kentucky and Missouri, or from rural areas in the Midwest, the news was deeply unsettling. These men had enlisted to save the Union, period. They had no personal quarrel with slavery, and some even had family who owned slaves. They felt betrayed. They believed the war's objectives had been changed without their consent. "I didn't sign up to free the slaves," was a common complaint heard around campfires. This created a serious crisis of morale. Desertion rates ticked up, and some officers even threatened to resign their commissions. Lincoln's government had to work hard to manage this internal dissent, constantly reassuring these soldiers that preserving the Union was still the primary goal, with emancipation now a necessary strategy to achieve it. Meanwhile, in the Confederacy, the reaction was exactly what you'd expect. Pure, unadulterated fury. The proclamation was seen as a direct attack on their way of life, their economy, and their entire social structure. Confederate President Jefferson Davis called it the most execrable measure recorded in the history of guilty man. Across the South, newspapers and politicians condemned Lincoln as a tyrant, inciting a slave rebellion. They used it as a powerful propaganda tool, claiming it proved the Union's true intention all along was to destroy the South and append its racial hierarchy. This outrage galvanized the Confederate war effort. Any lingering hope for a negotiated peace was extinguished. For many Southerners, the war was now a fight for survival. They believed if the Union won, their world would be utterly destroyed. This fear, this defiant anger, hardened their resolve to fight on, no matter the cost. The proclamation also had a terrifying effect on the battlefield. The Confederacy announced it would not treat captured black soldiers as prisoners of war. Instead, they would be executed or sold back into slavery, a brutal policy that led to horrific massacres like the one at Fort Pillow. But what about the people at the very heart of this story, the 4 million enslaved individuals in the South? For them, the proclamation was a beacon of hope in the darkest of nights. News traveled slowly, passed in whispers from plantation to plantation, through what was known as the grapevine telegraph. It was a dangerous rumor to spread, but it spread like wildfire. While the proclamation didn't instantly free anyone in Confederate-held territory, it was a promise. It was official word from the President of the United States that freedom was coming. This knowledge was transformative. It emboldened enslaved people to resist in new ways. Many began to slow down their work, sabotage equipment, or simply walk off plantations and head for the nearest Union line. The arrival of the Union Army now meant liberation. These self-emancipated refugees provided invaluable intelligence, labor, and eventually, soldiers for the Union cause. The proclamation turned enslaved people from passive victims into active agents in their own liberation, fundamentally altering the dynamics of the war on the ground. It was a promise of a new dawn, and they were determined to see it through. So, as you can see, the Emancipation Proclamation wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a catalyst that ignited a spectrum of powerful emotions across the entire country. It brought joy, fear, anger, and hope, reshaping the very meaning of the Civil War for everyone involved. It clarified the stakes and ensured that the outcome of the war would determine not just the fate of the Union, but the future of freedom itself in America. Thank you so much for joining me for this chapter. I hope it gave you a deeper understanding of this pivotal moment in history. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our next chapter. See you next time. Hey everyone, welcome back to our deep dive. Today, we're tackling Chapter 11, and that's a big one. What the proclamation actually did? You probably have this image in your head of Abraham Lincoln signing a document, and instantly, all enslaved people in America were free. Well, the reality is a lot more complicated, and honestly, a lot more interesting. Let's unpack it together. So, what did the Emancipation Proclamation really do when Lincoln issued it? The common belief is that it freed every single enslaved person. But here's the crucial detail. It didn't. The proclamation declared that all enslaved people in states that were in rebellion against the United States were, and I quote, "thenceforward and forever free." This applied specifically to the Confederate States. Think about that for a second. It freed people in territories where the Union government had no actual power to enforce the order. It was like telling your neighbor to clean their house. You can say it, but you can't make them do it. So, who wasn't freed? This is where it gets really complex. The proclamation did not apply to the border states. These were slave states that had remained loyal to the Union: Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland, and Missouri. Lincoln was walking a very thin tightrope here. He desperately needed these states to stay in the Union. If he had tried to abolish slavery there, he risked pushing them to secede and join the Confederacy, which would have been a catastrophic blow to the Union war effort. So, in a strange twist of history, on January 1st, 1863, if you were an enslaved person in Confederate-controlled Mississippi, you were legally free in the eyes of the U.S. government. But if you were an enslaved person just across the river in Union-loyal Kentucky, you were not. It's a paradox that highlights the immense political pressures Lincoln was under. Naturally, people at the time had strong reactions. Abolitionists, who had been pushing for emancipation for decades, were thrilled, but also frustrated. They saw it as a monumental step forward, but many felt it didn't go far enough. Why not free everyone, everywhere, right now? On the other side, many in the North who were fighting solely to preserve the Union were now angry. They hadn't signed up to fight a war to end slavery. There were even desertions from the Union Army in protest. And in the South, the Confederate leadership used it as propaganda. They claimed it was proof that Lincoln was a tyrant trying to incite a slave rebellion and destroy their entire way of life. It only strengthened their resolve to fight. So, if it didn't immediately free everyone and cause so much division, why is it considered one of the most important documents in American history? Because it fundamentally transformed the very nature of the Civil War. Before the proclamation, the official Union goal was simply to preserve the United States as one country. It was a war about union. After the proclamation, it became a war for freedom. Every step the Union Army took into Confederate territory wasn't just about conquering land anymore. It was about liberating people. The war now had a powerful moral cause. This shift had a massive practical impact, too. The proclamation officially authorized the recruitment of black men into the Union Army and Navy. This was nearly 200,000 black soldiers and sailors would go on to serve, providing a much-needed surge of manpower that was crucial to the Union victory. These men were fighting for their own freedom and the freedom of their families. Their bravery and determination on the battlefield helped to change the minds of many white Northerners who were prejudiced and skeptical about their ability to fight. They proved that this wasn't just a white man's war anymore. It was a struggle for the soul of the nation. Furthermore, the Emancipation Proclamation completely altered the war's international dimension. The Confederacy had been hoping for recognition and help from European powers like Britain and France. Both countries had economies that depended on Southern cotton. However, both had also abolished slavery decades earlier and had strong anti-slavery movements at home. Once Lincoln officially framed the war as a fight against slavery, it became politically impossible for any European nation to intervene on the side of the Confederacy. Supporting the South would now mean supporting slavery, and that was something the public in Britain and France would never stand for. Lincoln effectively isolated the Confederacy on the world stage. So, let's put it all together. Did the Emancipation Proclamation free all the slaves on day one? No. It was a strategic, limited military measure, born out of necessity. It didn't apply to the border states, and it could only be enforced as the Union Army advanced. But its impact went far beyond its immediate legal text. It redefined the purpose of the war, turning it into a crusade for human liberty. It unlocked a vital new source of military strength by allowing black soldiers to fight for their own liberation. And it thwarted the Confederacy's hopes for foreign aid. It was the beginning of the end for slavery in America. The full and final abolition of slavery would require the 13th Amendment to the Constitution 2 years later. But the Emancipation Proclamation was the pivotal moment, the turning point that made that final victory possible. It was a declaration of purpose that changed the course of history. That's the real story of what the proclamation did. It wasn't a simple, magic solution, but a complex, powerful, and transformative act of leadership in a time of crisis. Thanks so much for watching this breakdown of Chapter 11. I hope it gave you a clearer picture of this crucial moment. If you found this helpful, be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss our next chapter. See you then. When Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, he didn't just sign a document. He fundamentally reshaped the American Civil War. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a strategic masterstroke, a moral bombshell, and a turning point that would echo through history. Before the proclamation, the official Union goal was to preserve the United States, to bring the seceded states back into the fold. The institution of slavery, while the root cause of the conflict, wasn't the explicit target of the war effort. Many in the North were hesitant to make the war about abolition. But Lincoln never, the pragmatist and visionary, saw an opportunity to change the very nature of the fight. So, what did the Emancipation Proclamation actually do? It declared that all enslaved people in the Confederate States, the states in rebellion, shall be thenceforward and forever free. This was a bold and calculated move. Notice, it didn't apply to the border states, those slave states that had remained loyal to the Union, like Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, and Missouri. Why? Because Lincoln couldn't risk them switching sides. He needed their support to win the war. It was a military strategy, first and foremost. The proclamation was a weapon, aimed directly at the heart of the Confederacy's ability to wage war. Let's talk about the first major impact: crippling the Confederate war machine from within. The Southern economy, and by extension its military, was built on the backs of enslaved people. They weren't just picking cotton. Enslaved individuals were forced to build fortifications, repair railways, cook for soldiers, and transport supplies. They were the logistical backbone of the Confederate Army. Every shovel of dirt they moved, every meal they prepared, freed up a white Southern man to pick up a rifle and fight. The South's ability to field large armies was directly dependent on this vast, unpaid labor force. The Emancipation Proclamation turned this system on its head. It was a direct invitation to enslaved people to self-emancipate, to escape their bondage and seek refuge behind Union lines. And they responded in droves. As the Union Army pushed deeper into the South, the proclamation became a beacon of hope. Enslaved men, women, and children saw the approaching blue-coated soldiers not as invaders, but as liberators. They fled plantations, disrupting the agricultural production that fed the South and its armies. This created a massive internal crisis for the Confederacy. Plantation owners and Confederate officials were in a constant state of panic. Trying to prevent what they called a cervelé insurrection, they had to divert precious manpower, sending soldiers back home to guard against escapes and maintain control. This internal drain on resources was a wound that would bleed the Confederacy dry. Every person who escaped was one less pair of hands working for the rebellion and one more problem for the Confederate government to solve. It was a brilliant form of psychological and economic warfare. But the proclamation did more than just encourage escapes. It authorized the enlistment of African American men into the Union Army and Navy. This was a gift. Before 1863, there was immense resistance to the idea of arming black men. But with the war dragging on and casualties mounting, the Union desperately needed more soldiers. The proclamation opened the floodgates. By the end of the war, nearly 200,000 African American men had served in the Union forces. These were not just laborers. They were soldiers, fighting for their own freedom and the freedom of their families. Regiments like the famous 54th Massachusetts Infantry proved their courage and fighting prowess on battlefields like Fort Wagner. Their involvement did two crucial things. First, it provided a much-needed surge of manpower for the Union at a critical time when volunteer numbers were dwindling. Second, it was a powerful symbol. Black soldiers, wearing the Union blue and carrying rifles, were the ultimate refutation of the Confederacy's entire ideology. They were living, fighting, proof that the old order was crumbling. Their service and sacrifice helped turn the tide on the battlefield and forever change the perception of what African Americans could achieve. Now let us shift our focus to the second major impact, the transformation of the Union's moral cause. Before the proclamation, the war could be viewed by the outside world, particularly by European powers like Britain and France, as a regional dispute, a squabble over states' rights. The Confederacy worked hard to court these nations, hoping for official recognition and military aid. Their main leverage was King Cotton. The idea that Europe's textile industry was so dependent on Southern cotton that they would be forced to intervene. And for a while, it seemed like it might work. Both Britain and France had economic interests in a weakened United States and were sympathetic to the idea of an independent Confederacy. The Emancipation Proclamation shattered those hopes. It reframed the war in stark, moral terms. Suddenly, the conflict wasn't just about preserving a nation. It was a crusade against human bondage. It became a war of liberation. For countries like Great Britain, which had abolished slavery in its own empire decades earlier, this changed everything. The British public was strongly anti-slavery. How could their government possibly intervene on the side of a slaveholding republic fighting to preserve that very institution? It became politically impossible. The proclamation effectively isolated the Confederacy on the world stage, cutting off any chance of foreign intervention. Lincoln had successfully played the moral high card, ensuring that the Union would fight its battle alone, without European powers tipping the scales in favor of the South. This moral clarity also had a profound effect at home, in the North. While there was initial backlash from some who didn't want to fight an abolitionist war, the proclamation ultimately gave the Union cause a higher purpose. It energized the abolitionist movement and gave many soldiers a deeper, more profound reason to fight. They weren't just fighting for maps and flags. They were fighting for human freedom. This is beautifully captured in the words of soldiers, letters, and diaries from the period. Many who were once ambivalent about slavery came to see its destruction as essential. It also helped solidify support for the war effort, especially as people saw the bravery of black soldiers. It answered the difficult question of, what are we fighting for? With a powerful, simply, unswear. A new birth of freedom. In his Gettysburg Address, delivered just a few months after the proclamation took full effect, Lincoln would eloquently cement this new purpose, dedicating the nation to the proposition that all men are created equal. So, Let's recap the immense impact. The Emancipation Proclamation systematically dismantled the Confederacy's labor force, triggering a mass exodus of enslaved people that crippled its economy and war effort. It simultaneously bolstered the Union S ranks with nearly 200,000 determined African American soldiers who fought for their own liberation. And on the international and domestic front, it transformed the Civil War into a moral crusade against slavery, isolating the Confederacy diplomatically and imbuing the Union cause with a powerful, unifying purpose. It wasn't the single act that won the war, but it was undoubtedly a masterstroke that fundamentally altered the conflict's trajectory. It ensured that a Union victory would mean not just the preservation of a nation, but the end of slavery and the beginning of a long, difficult, but necessary journey toward fulfilling America's founding ideals. Thank you for watching. If you found this chapter of history insightful, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration into the past. See you next time. Hello, and welcome back to our deep dive into the American Civil War. Today, we're tackling a pivotal moment in the conflict, a chapter that fundamentally changed the course of the war and the future of the nation, the enlistment of black men into the Union Army. This isn't just a side story. It's a central part of the Union's path to victory. For the first 2 years of the war, the Union Army was exclusively a white man's army. The federal government, including President Lincoln, initially rejected the idea of enlisting black soldiers. There were several reasons for this. Many feared it would push the border states, those slave states still loyal to the Union, to secede. There was also widespread prejudice and doubt about the fighting ability of black men. It was a policy born of political calculation and deep-seated racism. But from the very beginning, black leaders and abolitionists like Frederick Douglass powerfully argued against this policy. Douglass famously declared, "Once let the black man get upon his person the brass letters. U.S. let him get an eagle on his button, and a musket on his shoulder and bullets in his pocket, and there is no power on earth which can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship." They saw military service as the most direct path to freedom and equality. The turning point came with the Emancipation Proclamation. While its primary purpose was to free enslaved people in the Confederate States, it also contained a radical provision authorizing the enlistment of black men into the armed forces. On January 1st, 1863, the Union war effort was officially transformed. It became not just a war to preserve the Union, but a war to end slavery. Almost immediately, black men rushed to enlist. Free men from the North and formerly enslaved men from the South flocked to recruiting stations. They were driven by a powerful desire to destroy the institution that had oppressed them and their families for generations. For them, this wasn't an abstract political conflict. It was a deeply personal fight for liberation. The result was the formation of the United States Colored Troops, or the U.S. While these regiments were commanded by white officers, the rank and file were composed entirely of black soldiers. The first federally recognized regiment was the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, made famous by the movie Glory. Its story is iconic, but it was just one of over 170 regiments that would be formed. Life for a soldier in the USCT was incredibly difficult. They faced discrimination from every direction. For a long time, they were paid less than their white counterparts, $10 a month, with $3 deducted for clothing, while white soldiers received $13 plus a clothing allowance. This blatant inequality was a source of great resentment. In fact, the men of the 54th Massachusetts famously refused to accept any pay until it was equalized, which it finally was in 1864, with back pay included. Beyond unequal pay, they often received inferior equipment, weapons, and medical care. They were frequently assigned to grueling manual labor, building fortifications and digging trenches, rather than being put on the front lines. This was partly due to the belief that they weren't suited for combat. However, when they did get the chance to fight, they shattered all expectations. Their bravery and determination were undeniable. At the Battle of Milliken's Bend in Louisiana, black troops, many of whom were recently freed and barely trained, repelled a fierce Confederate attack. An assistant secretary of war who witnessed the aftermath reported that the bravery of the blacks completely revolutionized the sentiment of the army. The assault on Fort Wagner in South Carolina by the 54th Massachusetts is another legendary example, though the attack was ultimately unsuccessful and resulted in heavy casualties, including the death of their commander. Colonel Robert Gould Shaw. The sheer courage displayed by the soldiers proved their mettle beyond any doubt. Their charge across the beach under heavy fire became a powerful symbol of black heroism. Throughout the war, USCT regiments participated in every major campaign of 1864 and 1865. They fought at the Battle of the Crater in Petersburg, in the Nashville Campaign, and during the final pursuit of Robert E. Lee's army. At the Battle of Newmarket Heights, also known as Chaffin's Farm, black soldiers displayed extraordinary valor, earning 14 medals of honor in a single day of fighting. Their impact on the war was immense. By the end of the conflict, nearly 200,000 black men had served in the Union Army and Navy. They made up about 10% of the Union's total fighting force. This influx of manpower came at a critical time when the North was struggling with recruitment. These soldiers helped to replenish the depleted ranks of the Union Army, giving it the numerical advantage needed to press on to victory. Their contribution was not just about numbers. The presence of black soldiers had a profound psychological effect. It demoralized the Confederacy, which saw its worst nightmare realized. Formerly enslaved people, armed and fighting for their own freedom. For the Union, it transformed the moral and political landscape of the war. It turned the conflict into a revolutionary struggle for human liberty. President Lincoln himself acknowledged their critical role. In a letter from August 1863, he wrote, "Some of the commanders of our armies in the field, who have given us our most important successes, believe the emancipation policy and the use of colored troops constitute the heaviest blow yet dealt to the rebellion." Later, he would state that, without the help of the USCT, the Union could not have won the war. The cost was high. Nearly 40,000 black soldiers died during the war, with a mortality rate significantly higher than that of white troops, largely due to disease, poor conditions, and the Confederate policy of executing or re-enslaving captured black soldiers rather than treating them as prisoners of war. The Fort Pillow Massacre is a horrific example of this, where Confederate forces under Nathan Bedford Forrest slaughtered black soldiers who were trying to surrender. But their sacrifice was not in vain. By fighting for the Union, these men were not just fighting for a nation, they were fighting for their own humanity. Their service irrevocably linked black identity with American patriotism and military valor. It was a powerful argument for citizenship and civil rights in the post-war era. While the struggle for true equality would continue for another century and beyond, the soldiers of the USCT laid an undeniable foundation for that fight. They proved that they were not just subjects to be freed, but agents of their own liberation. Their courage and sacrifice helped save the Union and end slavery, reshaping the United States into a nation that, at least in principle, was dedicated to freedom for all. Their story is a testament to the enduring power of fighting for what you believe in, and it's a chapter of American history that should never be forgotten. Thanks for watching. I hope this gave you a deeper appreciation for the incredible contributions of the United States colored troops. If you found this video informative, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more history content. We'll see you in the next chapter. Hello and welcome back to our channel. Today, we're diving deep into the intricate web of international reactions that followed one of the most pivotal moments of the last century. When news of the event first broke, it didn't just ripple through one nation. It sent shockwaves across the entire globe. But how did the world actually respond? It was far from a simple, unified reaction. Instead, it was a complex tapestry woven from threads of political allegiance, economic interest, and historical rivalries. Let's start by looking at the immediate neighbors. For countries sharing a border, the primary concern was stability. Would this event lead to a refugee crisis? Could the conflict spill over into their own territory? Leaders in these nations scrambled to convene emergency sessions, bolstering their border security and issuing cautious statements. Their diplomacy was a delicate balancing act. They had to appease their own anxious populations, while avoiding any language that could be seen as an escalation by their powerful neighbor. Publicly, they called for calm and dialogue, but behind closed doors, military advisors were drawing up contingency plans for every possible scenario. It was a time of immense tension, where a single misstep could have devastating consequences. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the major world powers were watching with keen interest. For them, this wasn't just a regional issue. It was a move on the global chessboard. In Washington, London, and Paris, The initial reaction was a mix of condemnation and strategic calculation. Public statements were strong, denouncing the actions and calling for a swift return to the status quo. The United Nations Security Council was called into an emergency session, becoming a theater for diplomatic showdowns. Ambassadors delivered impassioned speeches, but behind the powerful rhetoric, a different game was being played. Economists and policy advisors worked around the clock, debating the merits and risks of imposing sanctions. What kind of economic pressure would be most effective? And more importantly, could they get their allies to agree on a unified front? This was a major challenge, as different countries had varying levels of economic dependence on the region. A trade embargo that might cripple one nation's economy would be a mere inconvenience for another. Now, let's shift our focus to the other side of the equation, the allies and supporters. Not everyone condemned the event. For nations ideologically aligned with the main actor, this was seen as a necessary, even justified, action. Their state-controlled media outlets painted a completely different picture for their citizens. They portrayed the event not as an act of aggression, but as a righteous move to protect national interests or correct historical injustices. At the UN, their representatives used their veto power to block resolutions, creating a diplomatic stalemate. These countries also offered crucial economic and logistical support, ensuring that any sanctions imposed by the West would be softened. This created a clear divide in the global community, a polarization that would define international relations for years to come. It was a stark reminder that history is often told from multiple, conflicting perspectives. But what about the nations that tried to stay neutral? Countries in the non-aligned movement found themselves in an incredibly difficult position. They were under immense pressure from both sides to pick a faction. Their leaders walked a diplomatic tightrope, issuing carefully worded statements that called for peace without assigning blame. They understood that taking a definitive stand could jeopardize valuable trade relationships and expose them to political retaliation. For them, the priority was They offered to act as mediators, hosting secret talks and trying to find common ground between the opposing blocs. While their efforts were often overshadowed by the grandstanding of the superpowers, these neutral nations played a crucial, often unsung, role in preventing the conflict from spiraling into a full-blown global war. The economic fallout was immediate, and global markets went into a tailspin. Stock prices plummeted, and investors rushed to safe haven assets like gold. The price of oil and other key commodities skyrocketed, as traders worried about potential disruptions to supply chains. This had a direct impact on ordinary people around the world. Suddenly, the cost of filling up a car or heating a home became a major concern for families thousands of miles away from the conflict epicenter. Governments were forced to grapple with rising inflation and the threat of a global recession. The event served as a harsh lesson in just how interconnected our world economy has become, where a political decision in one corner of the globe can affect the financial well-being of millions in another. Beyond governments and economies, the reaction from the global public was powerful and visceral. The rise of 24-hour news and the early internet meant that images and stories from the ground spread faster than ever before. In cities from Tokyo to Toronto, massive protests erupted. People from all walks of life took to the streets, waving banners and chanting slogans. Some protested in solidarity with the affected population, while others protested against their own government's involvement or lack thereof. This grassroots activism put immense pressure on political leaders. It was no longer possible for them to make decisions purely based on cold, strategic calculations. They had to be mindful of public opinion, which was now a significant force in shaping foreign policy. Finally, we can't overlook the long-term consequences of these initial reactions. The diplomatic alliances that were forged and the rivalries that were deepened during this crisis set the stage for the next decade of international politics. The sanctions, while intended to be a temporary measure, had lasting effects on economies and led to a strategic realignment of global trade routes. The division in the UN Security Council exposed its limitations and sparked a long-running debate about the need for reform. Perhaps most importantly, the event reshaped how the world viewed sovereignty, intervention, and the responsibility of the international community to protect. The questions raised during those frantic weeks and months are still being debated today. The way the world responded became a case study for future generations of diplomats, a complex lesson in in the art and science of international relations. It showed that in a globalized world, no event happens in isolation. Every action creates a chain reaction, a series of echoes that reverberate across continents, shaping our shared history in ways we are still trying to fully understand. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into a critical chapter of modern history. If you found this analysis insightful, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more content like this. We'd also love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious. Hello and welcome back. Tonight, we're diving into Chapter 15, a special collection of personal stories about freedom. These are tales of courage, hope, and the unbreakable human spirit. They're designed to be gentle on the mind, perfect for winding down before sleep, while still honoring the profound journeys of those who sought and found their liberty. So, get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's begin. Our first story is about a young musician named Il. She lived in a land where music was strictly controlled. Only certain approved melodies were allowed, and any creative expression outside these rigid lines was forbidden. For Elara, this was like living in a world without color. Her heart was full of songs, symphonies that danced in her dreams, but she couldn't share them. She played the approved tunes during the day, her fingers moving skillfully, but her spirit feeling empty. By night, however, in the quiet of her small room, she would hum her own melodies softly into her pillow. She'd imagine a world where her music could fly free, reaching the ears and hearts of others. The fear of being discovered was a constant shadow, but the need to create was a light that refused to be extinguished. One evening, she met an old bookbinder who noticed the silent music in her eyes. He didn't speak of rebellion, but of preservation. He showed her how to write her music using a secret code, disguised as intricate patterns on the end papers of books. Each swirl was a note, each line a pause. Elara began to pour her soul onto these hidden pages. It wasn't the same as performing, but it was a form of freedom. She was saving her music, keeping it alive. Years went by, and Elara's secret library of songs grew. She never got to perform them for a grand audience in her youth. But she found her freedom not in applause, but in the act of defiance itself, the quiet, powerful act of creating against all odds, and preserving her art for a future she believed would one day come. Her freedom was the silent symphony she refused to let die. Next, we journeyed to a small coastal village to meet Kale. He was a fisherman, like his father and grandfather before him, but their village was ruled by a captain who claimed ownership of the sea itself. The villagers were forced to give him the largest share of their catch, leaving them with barely enough to survive. The captain's rules were the law, and his boats patrolled the waters, ensuring no one fished for themselves. Kale was a man of the sea. He understood its moods, its currents, its secrets. He felt that the ocean belonged to everyone, and to no one. He saw the hunger in his neighbors' eyes and the despair in their hearts. He knew that a direct confrontation would be disastrous. So, he decided to use his knowledge, not to fight, but to navigate. Kale started observing the tides and the stars more closely than ever before. He discovered hidden coves and secret fishing spots that the captain's patrols didn't know existed. Places accessible only during specific, narrow windows of time when the tides were just right. He didn't keep this knowledge to himself. Quietly, he began to teach a few trusted friends. They would go out in the dead of night, their small boats like shadows on the water, guided by Kale's star charts. They would fish in these secret spots and return before dawn with enough to feed their families. It was a risky act, but it was also an act of liberation. They weren't stealing. They were simply reclaiming what the ocean freely offered. Wordlessly, a small community of night fishermen was born. Their freedom wasn't won in a great battle, but found in the quiet ripple of an oar, the tug of a line in a secret cove, and the shared meal that tasted of defiance and the open sea. Let's now turn to the story of Lena, a librarian in a city where knowledge was curated and controlled. The grand library where she worked was full of books, but many sections were locked away, deemed unsuitable for the public. History was rewritten, stories were altered, and poetry that sparked too much feeling was hidden in dusty, forgotten vaults. Lena loved books, not just as objects, but as vessels of truth and imagination. Every locked door felt like a personal insult to her soul. Her job was to maintain the approved collection, but her passion was to preserve the forbidden ones. She began a silent, meticulous project. Using an old, forgotten cataloging system, she started creating a ghost library. She memorized the locations of the banned books, their contents, their authors. She couldn't check them out to anyone, but she could become a living index. When trusted patrons would ask a question that couldn't be answered by the approved texts, Lena would guide them with subtle hints. She might say, "The official history is on that shelf, but some poets from that era wrote about it differently. It's a shame their works are no longer in circulation." She would then describe the poem, the story, the historical account from memory. She was a bridge to the lost knowledge. Her act of freedom was an internal one. She couldn't unlock the vaults, but she could unlock the knowledge within herself and pass it on, person to person, in hushed tones among the shelves. She ensured that even if the books were imprisoned, their ideas could still roam free in the minds of the people. Our final story for tonight is about a young boy named Mateo, who lived in a gray, uniformed city. Everything was standardized. The clothes people wore, the houses they lived in, even the paths they walked. Individuality was seen as inefficient and disruptive. Mateo, however, was a dreamer. He saw colors where others saw gray. He saw faces in the clouds and imagined stories in the patterns of pavement cracks. His parents, worried for his safety, encouraged him to conform, to draw within the lines. But Mateo's imagination was a force of nature. He found his own small way to be free. He started collecting small, discarded objects: a smooth river stone, a fallen blue feather, a shard of colored glass, a twisted piece of wire. In the privacy of his room, he would assemble these simple objects into tiny, vibrant sculptures. He created miniature worlds bursting with color and life. He didn't show them to anyone at first. They were his secret garden, a sanctuary for his spirit. But one day, a friend saw his collection by accident. Instead of being confused, she was fascinated. She started collecting her own objects. Soon, a small group of children were secretly creating and sharing their tiny art installations. They would leave a colorful stone on a gray ledge or a small feather sculpture in the hollow of a tree. These were not grand statements of defiance, but small, personal whispers of freedom. They were tiny reminders that even in the most uniformed world, the human spirit can find a way to create beauty and express its own unique colors. Mateo's freedom wasn't about changing the whole city, but about creating his own small, colorful corner within it. These stories remind us that the path to freedom takes many forms. It can be a silent act of preservation, a clever use of knowledge, a whispered truth, or a small, personal expression of creativity. It's the enduring power of the human spirit to seek light, even in the shadows. I hope these tales have brought you a sense of peace and inspiration. Thank you for listening. May your dreams be filled with hope, and your rest be deep. Good night. Hello and welcome back to our journey through history. Today, we're diving into a pivotal and often misunderstood chapter. The era immediately following emancipation. For millions of newly freed African Americans, the end of the Civil War wasn't just an endpoint. It was the beginning of a profound and challenging new journey. Let's explore the immense hurdles they faced and the incredible resilience they showed. Imagine, for a moment, that the world you've always known, as unjust as it was, has been completely upended. Freedom, a word longed for and prayed for, has finally arrived. But what does it mean in practice? For the 4 million people freed from bondage, the first and most urgent challenge was finding family. Decades of slavery had deliberately and brutally torn families apart. Husbands were sold away from wives, and children were separated from their parents, often with no record of where they went. The immediate aftermath of the Civil War saw a massive, continent-wide movement of people. It was a heartbreaking and yet hopeful pilgrimage. People walked hundreds, sometimes thousands, of miles, driven by the slim hope of reuniting with a loved one. They placed advertisements in newspapers, which became a vital tool in this search. These ads are incredibly powerful historical documents. You'd see notices like, "Information wanted of my son, sold from me 10 years ago," with a brief description and the last known location. It is a testament to the enduring power of family bonds that people held on to these memories and embarked on these quests, often against impossible odds. Some were successful, leading to incredibly emotional reunions. But for many others, the search ended in heartbreak. Their families lost forever to the brutal system of slavery. This search for kin wasn't just about emotion. It was about rebuilding the very foundation of community. Next, let's talk about education. Under slavery, it was illegal in most southern states to teach an enslaved person to read or write. Knowledge was seen as a threat to the system. So, when freedom came, the desire for education was explosive. It was seen as the primary key to true liberation and a symbol of their new status as citizens. Children and adults, from young kids to elderly grandparents, flocked to any school they could find. These first schools were often humble affairs. They were held in basements, in abandoned buildings, in churches, or even out in the open air. Teachers were a mix of dedicated northern missionaries, both black and white, and literate African Americans, who were eager to share their knowledge. The Freedmen's Bureau, a federal agency established to aid the transition from slavery to freedom, played a crucial role by helping to establish thousands of schools. This thirst for learning was profound. People would work all day in the fields and then walk 4 miles to attend night school, eager to learn the alphabet, to read the Bible for themselves, to understand contracts, and to participate in the political process. The establishment of historically black colleges and universities, or HBCUs, during this period is a monumental achievement. Institutions like Howard, Fisk, and Morehouse were founded to train teachers, ministers, and leaders who would guide their communities for generations to come. This educational movement was a powerful act of self. Of course, a person needs to eat, and that leads us to the challenge of work. Freedom meant the freedom to work for oneself and to be paid for one's labor. But the economic landscape of the South was devastated. The old plantation system had collapsed, and a new system had to be built. Most freed people had only ever known agricultural work, and land ownership was the ultimate dream. Owning your own land meant true economic independence. It was the promise of 40 acres and a mule. Sadly, this promise largely went unfulfilled. Widespread land redistribution from former Confederates to freed people never happened on a large scale. President Andrew Johnson, who succeeded Lincoln, reversed early efforts to give land to former slaves. This left most African Americans as a landless labor force. The system that emerged was sharecropping. On the surface, it seemed like a step up. A family would rent a plot of land from a landowner who would provide seeds, tools, and supplies. In return, the family would give the owner a share of the crop at the end of the year. Typically half. However, in practice, sharecropping often became a new form of bondage. The landowners, who were almost always the former masters, controlled the system. They set the prices for supplies, they weighed the cotton, and they kept the books. With high interest rates and dishonest accounting, it was almost impossible for a sharecropper to come out ahead. Many families ended the year deeper in debt to the landowner than when they started, legally tying them to the land for another year to pay it off. This cycle of debt peonage trapped generations of families in poverty, denying them the economic independence they had fought so hard for. Despite it, some individuals and families did manage to save enough to buy their own land, a testament to their incredible thrift and determination against a system designed to keep them down. Finally, and perhaps most critically, was a challenge of protection and basic safety. Gaining freedom and citizenship rights on paper was one thing. Exercising them in reality was another. The post-war South was a dangerous and violent place for African Americans. Many white Southerners, defeated in war and resentful of the new social order, resisted black freedom with terrorism and intimidation. Secret societies like the Ku Klux Klan were formed with the explicit goal of restoring white supremacy through violence. Black citizens who dared to vote, to start a business, to own land, or simply to act as a free person were targeted. They faced threats, beatings, the burning of their homes and schools, and murder. Federal troops were stationed in the South during the period known as Reconstruction to protect these new rights, and for a time, there was real progress. Black men were voting, holding political office at every level, from local sheriff to U.S. senator, and helping to write new state constitutions. However, by 1877, the federal government's will to enforce these protections had faded. The troops were withdrawn, and white supremacist redeemer governments took back control of the South. They quickly passed a series of laws known as Black Codes, and later Jim Crow laws, which systematically stripped African Americans of their rights. Literacy tests and poll taxes were used to prevent them from voting. Segregation was legally enforced in every aspect of life, from schools and hospitals to water fountains. The promise of equality was brutally suppressed, and the quest for protection became an ongoing struggle for survival. So, when we look back at the era after emancipation, it's a story of incredible challenges. The struggle to find family, the passionate pursuit of education, the fight for economic independence through fair work, and the desperate need for physical protection to find the lives of a generation. But it is not a story of victory. It is a story of profound agency, resilience, and courage. In the face of unimaginable obstacles, newly freed people built communities, established churches and schools, created vibrant cultural traditions, and laid the groundwork for the long civil rights struggle that would follow. They transformed a moment of freedom into a movement for justice, and their legacy continues to inspire us today. Understanding these challenges gives us a much deeper appreciation for the meaning of freedom and the enduring fight to achieve it. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this chapter of history enlightening, please give this video a like and subscribe for more. We'll see you next time. Hey everyone, welcome back to our deep dive into American history. Today, we're tackling Chapter 17, a pivotal moment in the nation's story. The road toward the 13th Amendment. This isn't just about a piece of legislation. It's about a fundamental shift in the very soul of America. And it all begins with a document that, on its own, wasn't enough. The Emancipation Proclamation. So, let's set the scene. It's January 1st, 1863. The Civil War is raging, and President Abraham Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, there's a common misconception that this single act freed all enslaved people overnight, but the reality was far more complex. The proclamation was a strategic military measure. It declared that all enslaved individuals in the Confederate States, the states in active rebellion against the Union, were, thenceforward and forever free. But what about the border states? States like Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri were slave states, but they hadn't seceded. They were loyal to the Union. The proclamation deliberately did not apply to them. Lincoln was walking a tightrope. He desperately needed to keep these states in the Union, and he feared that freeing the enslaved people there would push them into the arms of the Confederacy. So, slavery remained legal in parts of the United States, even after the proclamation. Furthermore, the proclamation's power was limited by military control. It only had real teeth in areas of the South that the Union Army had conquered. In Confederate-held territory, it was a promise, a beacon of hope, but not an immediate reality. An enslaved person in rural Georgia, far from Union lines, was still under the control of their enslaver. The proclamation was a powerful symbol and a crucial turning point, but it was not a final solution. It transformed the war's purpose, explicitly making it a fight for freedom, not just for the preservation of the Union. It also authorized the recruitment of black men into the Union Army and Navy, which was again nearly 200,000 would serve, fighting for their own liberation and for the future of the country. But Lincoln knew the proclamation's limitations. As a wartime executive order, its legal standing could be challenged once the war was over. What would stop a future Congress or Supreme Court from overturning it? What would happen to the newly freed people? What about the enslaved individuals in the border states? The only way to permanently and unequivocally end slavery everywhere in the United States, to write its demise into the nation's DNA, was to amend the Constitution itself. This is where Lincoln's focus shifted. He became convinced that a constitutional amendment was the only path forward. It was an audacious goal. Amending the Constitution is incredibly difficult. It requires a 2/3 majority in both the House of Representatives and the Senate, and then ratification by 3/4 of the states. And in 1864, this was far from a sure thing. The political landscape was treacherous. The Democratic Party was largely opposed to abolition. They campaigned on a platform of peace at any price, which often meant letting the Confederacy go and preserving slavery where it existed. Even within Lincoln's own Republican Party, there were factions. The radical Republicans were pushing hard for abolition and full civil rights, while more moderate members were hesitant, Worried about the political fallout, Lincoln's first attempt to get the amendment through the House of Representatives in June of 1864 failed. It didn't get the necessary two-thirds majority. It was a major setback. Many thought the dream of a constitutional end to slavery was dead. The war was dragging on, casualties were mounting, and public morale was low. Lincoln's own re-election in 1864 was far from certain. His opponent, General George McClellan, was running on a peace platform that would have almost certainly meant the end of the push for abolition. But then, the tide began to turn. Key Union military victories, particularly General Sherman's capture of Atlanta in September 1864, revitalized support for the war and for Lincoln. His landslide re-election gave him a powerful mandate from the people. He saw this victory not just as a mandate to win the war, but as a mandate to win the peace by destroying slavery for good. He decided not to wait for the new, more Republican-heavy Congress to be seated. He wanted to push the amendment through the lame duck session of the old Congress, the period between the election and the inauguration of the new members. This was his window of opportunity. Lincoln knew that every day the war continued, more lives were lost. He believed that passing the amendment could even hasten the end of the war, by showing the Confederacy that there was no future for their peculiar institution, no hope of a negotiated peace that would preserve it. So, in the winter of 1864 and early 1865, Lincoln rolled up his sleeves and engaged in some of the most intense political maneuvering of his presidency. This wasn't just about lofty speeches. This was about backroom deals, arm twisting, and raw political calculation. He used every tool at his disposal. He offered political appointments to outgoing Democrats who were on the fence. He appealed to their patriotism, to their conscience, to their self. He met with congressmen personally, using his famous blend of logic, folksy wisdom, and steely resolve. He argued that the amendment was the only way to justify the immense sacrifice of the war. How could they tell the families of hundreds of thousands of fallen soldiers that it was all for nothing, that the root cause of the conflict would be allowed to fester and potentially cause another war down the line? He also made a powerful legal argument. The amendment would validate the Emancipation Proclamation, putting it on unshakable constitutional ground. The vote in the House of Representatives on January 31st, 1865, was one of the most dramatic moments in American political history. The galleries were packed. The tension was palpable. As the clerk called the roll, every vote was tallied with bated breath. It was going to be incredibly close. Lincoln and his allies had been working tirelessly to secure every possible aye. They needed 117 votes for the two-thirds majority. One by one, the names were called. When the final tally was announced, the amendment had passed by a razor-thin margin, with just 2 votes to spare. The official count was 119-56. The chamber erupted. Reports from the time described grown men weeping, strangers embracing, and a thunderous roar of cheers that could be heard outside on the streets of Washington. It was a moment of profound triumph and catharsis. The legislative battle was won. The amendment itself is remarkably simple and powerful. Section 1 reads, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction." With those 27 words, an institution that had existed for 250 years and had torn the nation apart was formally condemned to die. Section 2 gave Congress the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation, a clause that would become crucial during the Reconstruction era. After passing Congress, the amendment was sent to the states for ratification. The process moved swiftly. With the Union's victory in sight, state after state voted to approve it. Tragically, Abraham Lincoln would not live to see the final ratification. He was assassinated in April 1865, just a few months after the amendment cleared Congress. But his life's final great work was nearly complete. On December 6, 1865, when Georgia became the 27th state to ratify it, the 13th Amendment officially became part of the United States Constitution. It was a monumental achievement, the culmination of a long and bloody struggle. It started with the limited, strategic step of the Emancipation Proclamation and ended with a fundamental, permanent rewriting of the nation's highest law. The road to the 13th Amendment shows us that history is made not just by grand pronouncements, but by grit, political courage, and the relentless determination to turn a moral ideal into a legal reality. It was a promise fulfilled, and it laid the foundation for the ongoing struggle for freedom and equality in America. Thanks so much for watching. This is a complex but incredibly important part of our history. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more. We'll see you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our channel. Today, we're diving deep into the heart of American history to explore the immense responsibility and unparalleled leadership of one of its most towering figures, Abraham Lincoln. Chapter 18 of our series focuses on how this one man shouldered the weight of a nation on the brink of collapse and guided it through its darkest hour. Think about it for a moment. What does it mean to be responsible for the very soul of a country? For Lincoln, this wasn't an abstract concept. It was his daily reality. When he took the oath of office in March 1861, 7 states had already seceded from the Union. The nation was fractured, teetering on the edge of a catastrophic civil war. The responsibility that fell upon his shoulders was nothing short of monumental. To preserve the Union, to uphold the Constitution, and to navigate a crisis that had been brewing for decades. Many leaders would have crumbled under such pressure. The path of least resistance might have been to let the seceding states go, to avoid the bloodshed that seemed inevitable. But Lincoln's leadership was defined by his unwavering commitment to a singular, profound idea that the United States was a perpetual union, an experiment in democracy that could not be allowed to fail. This wasn't just about politics or territory. For Lincoln, it was a moral imperative. He believed the future of liberty itself, not just in America, but for the entire world, was at stake. One of the most telling aspects of Lincoln's leadership was his willingness to take ultimate responsibility. He famously kept a letter on his desk from a critic that he would read to remind himself of the public's frustration. He didn't deflect blame or make excuses. When the Union Army suffered devastating losses, he felt each one personally. He was known to spend sleepless nights at the telegraph office, anxiously awaiting news from the front lines. The weight of every soldier's life, every family's grief, rested heavily upon him. His famous quote, "I am a firm believer in the people. If given the truth, they can be depended upon to meet any national crisis," shows his faith in democracy. But it also underscores his belief that it was his job to provide that truth, no matter how difficult. But responsibility is one thing. Effective leadership is another. How did Lincoln actually lead? First, he was a master of communication. In an era without television or internet, his words were his most powerful tool. Speeches like the Gettysburg Address and his second inaugural address are masterpieces of political and moral rhetoric. He didn't just give orders. He persuaded, he inspired, and he unified. He had an incredible ability to distill complex, divisive issues into clear, powerful, and deeply moving language that resonated with the common person. He framed the war not just as a conflict over states' rights, but as a struggle for the future of freedom and equality, a new birth of freedom. Second, Lincoln's leadership was marked by his incredible political skill. His cabinet was famously composed of his political rivals, a team of rivals, as one historian called it. Many would see this as a recipe for disaster, but Lincoln saw it as a source of strength. He wanted to hear diverse, often conflicting, viewpoints. He wasn't afraid of being challenged. This allowed him to consider all angles of a problem and make more informed decisions. He managed these huge egos with a deft combination of patience, humor, and iron will, ensuring that their collective talents served the Union's cause rather than their own ambitions. Furthermore, Lincoln was not a rigid idealist. His views, particularly on slavery, evolved over time. Initially, his primary goal was solely to preserve the Union. But as the war progressed, his understanding of its deeper meaning grew. He came to see that the Union could not be truly saved without ending the institution that had caused the division in the first place. The Emancipation Proclamation was a pivotal moment. It was a bold, controversial, and risky move. It transformed the purpose of the war, turning it into a moral crusade against slavery. This adaptability, this willingness to grow and change his position based on moral conviction and strategic necessity, is a hallmark of his great leadership. Let's also talk about his role as Commander-in-Chief. Lincoln, a man with very little military experience, took it upon himself to become a student of military strategy. He read books on warfare, corresponded directly with his generals, and often visited the troops in the field. He was frequently frustrated by the caution of his early commanders, like George McClellan. Lincoln understood something fundamental that some of his generals did not. This was a new kind of war, a total war that required relentless pressure and a willingness to fight decisively. He searched tirelessly for a general who shared his vision, a general who would fight. He finally found that in Ulysses S. Grant. The trust and partnership between Lincoln and Grant were crucial to the Union's ultimate victory. Lincoln gave Grant the strategic freedom he needed, and Grant delivered the results Lincoln had been seeking for so long. Throughout it all, Lincoln's character was his anchor. His humility, his empathy, and his resilience were legendary. He was known for his wit and his storytelling, which he often used to diffuse tense situations or to make a point more effectively than a direct order could. But beneath the folksy exterior was a man of profound melancholy and steely determination. The personal tragedies he endured, including the death of his young son Willie in the White House, added to the immense burden he carried. Yet, he never lost his compassion. He was constantly besieged by people seeking pardons or favors, and he was known to show mercy whenever he could, especially to soldiers sentenced for desertion. He understood the human cost of the conflict he was presiding over. In his second inaugural address, delivered just weeks before his assassination, Lincoln sought not to celebrate victory, but to set the stage for healing and reconciliation. His call to act, with malice toward none, with charity for all, is perhaps the most powerful expression of his leadership philosophy. He knew that winning the war was only half the battle. The even greater challenge would be to bind up the nation's wounds and create a just and lasting peace. This forward-looking vision, this focus on reuniting a broken country rather than punishing the defeated, is the ultimate testament to his sense of responsibility. So, when we look back at Lincoln, we see more than just a president. We see a leader who embraced an almost unbearable responsibility, who led with a combination of moral clarity and political pragmatism, who communicated with timeless eloquence, and who guided a divided nation toward a new birth of freedom. His leadership wasn't perfect, and historians continue to debate his decisions. But what remains undeniable is the profound sense of duty he felt to the American experiment, and his unshakable resolve to see it through its greatest trial. He remains the standard by which American presidents, and indeed leaders around the world, are often measured. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into Lincoln's leadership. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more explorations of history as most fascinating figures. Let us know in the comments what aspect of Lincoln's leadership you find most inspiring. We'll see you in the next video. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our historical journey. Today, we're exploring the profound and lasting legacy of the Emancipation Proclamation. It's easy to see it as a single moment in time, a stroke of a pen by Abraham Lincoln, but its impact rippled through the decades, shaping the very fabric of America and inspiring movements for freedom across the globe. This isn't just a story about the end of the Civil War. It's the story of a promise of freedom that would be fought for, defended, and expanded upon by generations to come. So, how did a wartime executive order become such an enduring symbol? First, we have to understand its immediate power. While it didn't free every enslaved person overnight, it fundamentally transformed the purpose of the Civil War. It was no longer just about preserving the Union. It was now a fight for human liberty. This moral clarity energized the Union cause and laid the groundwork for what was to come. For African Americans, both enslaved and free, it was a beacon of hope. It was official recognition from the highest office in the land that their freedom was not just a dream, but a national objective. This was a psychological victory of immense proportions. The proclamation's most direct legal successor was the 13th Amendment. Lincoln and other leaders recognized that the proclamation was a wartime measure, its legal standing potentially questionable after the conflict ended. To make emancipation permanent and universal, a constitutional amendment was necessary. The political will to pass the 13th Amendment, which officially abolished slavery throughout the United States in 1865, was built directly on the foundation laid by the Emancipation Proclamation. It was the crucial first step that made the final, legally binding step possible. Without the proclamation, the momentum for a constitutional ban on slavery might never have materialized so swiftly. Following the 13th Amendment, the era of Reconstruction began, a tumultuous period where the nation grappled with how to integrate millions of newly freed African Americans into society. The promise of the proclamation fueled the push for further protections, leading to the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship and equal protection under the law, and the 15th Amendment, which granted black men the right to vote. These Reconstruction amendments were direct attempts to fulfill the promise of freedom and equality that the proclamation had initiated. They were designed to build a new, more inclusive nation on the ashes of the old one. Of course, this progress faced a brutal and violent backlash. After Reconstruction ended in 1877, the era of Jim Crow began. Southern states implemented discriminatory laws, segregation, and voter suppression tactics that effectively stripped African Americans of their newly won rights. It was a dark period where the promise of the proclamation seemed to be broken. Yet, even in these oppressive times, the proclamation was never forgotten. It lived on as a symbol of what America was supposed to be, a foundational document that civil rights activists could point to and say, "This is the promise you made. This is the freedom we were guaranteed." This brings us to the modern civil rights movement of the 20th century. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. masterfully used the legacy of the Emancipation Proclamation in their rhetoric. In his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, delivered at the Lincoln Memorial in 1963 on the centennial of the proclamation, Dr. King called it a momentous decree that came as a great beacon light of hope. But he also poignantly noted that 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. He framed the movement not as a request for new rights, but as a demand to cash a promissory note that the proclamation represented by connecting their struggle directly back to Lincoln and the Civil War. Activists highlighted the nation's hypocrisy and called upon it to finally live up to its founding ideals. The legacy wasn't confined to American borders. The Emancipation Proclamation resonated with oppressed people all over the world. It became a powerful symbol in the global fight against colonialism and tyranny. Activists in places like South Africa, fighting against apartheid, and in various independence movements across Africa and Asia, looked to the American experience. They saw the proclamation as proof that a nation could, through struggle and moral conviction, confront its own injustices and chart a new course toward freedom. It was a universal story of liberation that transcended its specific American context. It showed that governmental power could be used as a force for emancipation, not just oppression. Even today, the proclamation continues to be a subject of discussion and debate. Historians analyze its strategic importance, its limitations, and its symbolic power. We debate Lincoln's motivations. Was he the great emancipator or a pragmatic politician? But regardless of these debates, its impact is undeniable. The proclamation stands as a pivotal moment in the long, ongoing struggle for justice and equality in America. It's a reminder that progress is often incremental, hard-won, and requires constant vigilance. It marked the point of no return, where the United States officially committed itself, however imperfectly, to the principle of universal freedom. In the end, the long-term legacy of the Emancipation Proclamation is not just about a single document. It's about the idea it unleashed. The idea that freedom is a right, not a privilege. This idea fueled constitutional amendments, inspired generations of activists, and became a symbol of hope for people around the world. It serves as a permanent reminder of both how far we've come and how far we still have to go to fully realize the promise of liberty and justice for all. The story of the proclamation is, in many ways, the story of America, itself a story of struggle, progress, and the enduring power of a declared ideal. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the legacy of the Emancipation Proclamation. I hope it gave you a new perspective on this crucial piece of history. If you found this video insightful, please give it a like and subscribe for more content. We'll see you in the next one. The year 1863. It was under just another year in the calendar of a nation torn apart by war. It was a fulcrum, a moment in time upon which the very destiny of America would pivot. The air was thick with the smoke of cannons and the cries of the wounded. But through this haze, a new light was beginning to break. This was the year the conflict transformed. It ceased to be merely a struggle to preserve a union of states, and became something far more profound, a battle for the soul of the nation itself. Before 1863, the primary objective of the Union war effort, at least officially, was reunification. The question of slavery, while undeniably the root cause of the secession, was often tiptoed around. But the brutal, grinding reality of the war made it impossible to ignore the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the American experiment. How could a nation conceived in liberty continue to hold millions in bondage? The Emancipation Proclamation, which took full effect on January 1st, 1863, was the thunderclap that answered this question. It was a declaration that the war was now a war for freedom. This wasn't just a legal document, it was a moral earthquake. It redrew the battle lines, not on a map, but in the hearts and minds of the people. For the enslaved, it was a beacon of hope, a promise whispered on the wind that liberation was no longer a distant dream but an approaching reality. For the Union soldiers, it gave a new, more powerful purpose to their sacrifice. They were no longer just fighting for geography. They were fighting for humanity. And for the nation, it was a moment of reckoning. The proclamation laid bare the hypocrisy and forced a confrontation with the founding ideals of the country. The impact was immediate and transformative. Suddenly, the Union Army became an army of liberation. As it advanced into Confederate territory, freedom followed in its wake. Nearly 200,000 black men, many of them formerly enslaved, would enlist in the Union Army and Navy. They fought with a courage and determination that was born of a deeply personal stake in the outcome. They were fighting for their own freedom, for their families, and for a future where their children would not be born into chains. Their presence on the battlefield was a powerful symbol of this new birth of freedom, a living testament to the changing purpose of the war. Think of the bravery it took. A black soldier, wearing the Union blue, marching back onto the very plantations where he might have been enslaved, was a revolutionary act. They faced not only the dangers of combat, but also the certainty of harsher treatment, even execution, if captured. Yet they fought. They fought at Port Hudson, at Milliken's Bend, and most famously, at Fort Wagner. Their heroism shattered racist myths about their capabilities and their desire for liberty. They proved, beyond any doubt, that they were not passive recipients of freedom, but active agents in their own liberation. And as the war raged on, the concept of freedom itself began to expand. It was no longer just about the absence of chains. It was about the promise of citizenship, the right to dignity, the opportunity for a family to live and thrive without fear. This redefinition of American liberty was happening everywhere. In the contraband camps, where newly freed people sought refuge, in the political debates in Washington, and on the bloody fields of battle. Nowhere was this new vision articulated more powerfully than on a late autumn day in Pennsylvania. The Battle of Gettysburg, fought in July of 1863, was a cataclysm. The sheer scale of the slaughter was unimaginable. In its aftermath, the nation was left to grapple with the meaning of such a sacrifice. President Abraham Lincoln, standing on that consecrated ground, gave a speech that would echo through the ages. The Gettysburg Address was more than just a eulogy. It was a rededication of the nation to its founding principles, now seen through the lens of emancipation. Lincoln spoke of a new birth of freedom. These 4 words captured the essence of 1863. He connected the struggle of the present to the ideals of 1776, suggesting that the Civil War was a second American Revolution. The first had established a nation conceived in liberty, but that liberty was incomplete. The war was the fiery crucible in which a more inclusive, more just, and more perfect union could be forged. He argued that the soldiers who died at Gettysburg did not die simply to preserve the old Union, but to create a new one, a nation where the government of the people, mighty people, for the people, would not perish from the earth. And by the people, it was now implicitly understood that this must include all people. This was a radical reimagining of the American project. The nation was not just a political entity but a moral one, with a responsibility to uphold the promise of equality for all its citizens. The war, from this point forward, was imbued with a sacred purpose. Every battle, every casualty, was part of a painful but necessary process of national redemption. It was the price being paid for the nation's original sin of slavery. The road from 1863 was still long and arduous. The war would continue for nearly 2 more years, filled with more bloodshed and hardship. The path to true equality and justice for African Americans would be fraught with setbacks, betrayals, an immense struggle for generations to come. The new birth of freedom that Lincoln spoke of was not a singular event, but the beginning of a long, ongoing journey. But 1863 was the turning point. It was the year the dam broke. The moral and political momentum had shifted decisively. The idea of freedom, once a fragile and contested concept, was now placed firmly at the center of the American identity. It became the defining promise of the nation, the standard against which it would be judged, and the ideal toward which it must constantly strive. As we look back from the vantage point of our own time, we can see the long shadow that 1863 casts. It is a reminder that history is not static, that nations can change, and that the meaning of words like liberty and equality can evolve and expand. It teaches us that progress is often born from struggle and sacrifice, and that the fight for a more perfect union is never truly over. The events of that pivotal year set in motion a chain of events that would lead to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, fundamentally reshaping the Constitution and American society. It began a conversation about citizenship, rights, and equality that we are still having today. The new birth of freedom was not just an end to slavery. It was the beginning of a new chapter in the American story, a chapter that is still being written, and in its pages, we find the enduring legacy of 1863. A nation, forked in fire and rededicated to the audacious and beautiful promise of freedom for all. Thank you for joining us on this journey through a pivotal moment in history. If you found this reflection meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that have shaped our world. See you next time.